Today's lesson is 13.7, decimal place value. The objective for today is that I will use decimal models and place value charts to show different ways of reading and writing decimals. The first problem we're looking at says, Joe is competing in a game show. Every time he answers a question correctly, a bulb lights up. This is what the board looks like at the end of the show. How could you describe Joe's score? So when I take a look at this, I automatically know that if I add up if I add up how many I have on the outside, I have 10, and on the bottom I have 10 as well. So I know that there's 100 total squares in here. That makes it pretty easy for me to see that he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rows. Well, if it did 8 rows of 10, I know that's 80. Plus he has 1, 2, 3 more. So I can see that he has 83 out of the 100 possible that are lit up. Another way to talk about that is as a fraction, which we just talked about was 83 hundredths. We had previously talked about how I can write decimals or fractions as decimals. So if I have 83 hundredths, I can use my chart and see that if I need my 83 hundredths, I write it in word form like this, 83 hundredths. I read it the same way I would read it as a fraction, so 83 hundredths. And to write it as a decimal, I always like to write my 0, but I don't have to. But I do have to have the decimal point. I read it as 83 hundredths. That means the last digit in the number I'm saying has to end up in the place value that I'm working with. So 83 hundredths, the 3 is in the hundredths place value. Make sure you have that part written down in your notes too. If the grid represents one whole, what does one column represent? Well, we just talked about it, that there was 10 squares in each one, so each column would represent a tenth. So the value of 8 full columns would have to be 8 tenths. The value of 3 squares in the 9th column, well, if I'm looking at each one of these, each one is representing 100. So if I have 3 of them, it would be 3 hundredths. So how many squares are shaded in all, which we just said was 83 hundredths. In your notes, I want you to include this right here, 3 and 91 hundredths. Again, I read it as the whole number first. I always use the word and to represent my decimal, and then each digit is in a separate place value. So just like our place value unit at the very beginning of the year, we separate out each digit from its place value, and we can write it in expanded form and word form. We're going to do the same thing we just did with 3 and 91 hundredths with number 2, which is 6 and 87 hundredths. So it's asking me to write it in expanded form. But remember, expanded form means I'm separating out each place value and writing it as an addition problem. So I have 6, which is a whole number, plus the first place value, which is in the tenths place, plus the digit that is in the hundredths place, which was my 7. So if I were to bring all of these back together, it would end up being what I have right here, the original number I started with. On 3 and 4, it says to draw and shade a grid for each number, and then write the word form of each number. For these, I'm not going to worry about shading a grid. I just want you to write the word form and do expanded form. So for number 1, if I'm writing it in expanded, I have 1 plus the next place value that I have. So in this one, I don't have a number in the tenths place except for a 0, and I'm not going to do a plus 0. So I just have to add together 1 plus 6 hundredths. Well, now I need to write it in word form. So I have to write it as 1 and, remember the decimal has to be written as the word and, 1 and 6, whatever place value that digit is in, which would be hundredths. So I would write it as 1 and 6 hundredths. The next thing you need to take care of is number 4. And for number 4, I want you to try doing that one on your own. Again, write it in expanded and word. Don't worry about the grid. And have that ready to go in your notes.